It's 1300 hours GMT. I'm Kamal Santamaria. We are beginning this news hour with breaking news on the Russia-Ukraine situation. On a day that has been dominated actually by suggestions of a possible summit between the US and Russia, we are now getting reports of a significant escalation on that Russia-Ukraine border. In fact, Russia's army says it has killed what it is calling saboteurs from Ukraine. So let's start with Dorsa Jabari in Moscow. Following these lines, which are coming out of the Interfax news agency in Russia, what more do you have, Dorsa?
Well, according to the Russian military, 5 people have been killed as they allegedly attempted to cross the border into Russia. Now, the Russian military also says that they have destroyed 2 armored personnel carriers from the Ukrainian military that were in Rostov region on Monday morning. This means that Russians are accusing the Ukrainian military of having armored personnel carriers on Russian soil. Of course, this is something the Ukrainian military has just now denied, saying that it is fake news. I think this is significant now because the information we're getting about this incident allegedly is coming from the Russian military itself and not the separatist leaders that we've been hearing from in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region. This is the first time the Russian army is directly saying what has taken place according to them. Of course, all this is happening as there is an influx of refugees leaving the Donbass region and crossing over into Russia as of Friday, when there was a call for them to evacuate the women and children and the elderly from that region because of the ongoing violence that was escalating between the Russian-backed separatists there and the Ukrainian military. The Russians have closed the border from their side, so they're not allowing people to go into Ukraine. They're only dealing with the influx of people coming in. This, of course, makes the situation much more dangerous, not only for the ongoing diplomatic talks, but also for those people that are trying to get into Russia and into other regions of this country. The Rostov region is now one of the many regions that is taking in these people, and they've also declared a state of emergency. We understand that over 70,000 people have left the Donbass region and are now in Russia, and a number of them will also be arriving in the capital, Moscow, on Tuesday morning. This, of course, is going to be seen as very much a major escalation in the ongoing dispute that is happening in that region. And of course, this is going on as President Vladimir Putin is due to hold an emergency session with his Security Council to discuss the ongoing situation in the country's borders. This was one of the things the Russians had warned against, and what the West was warning against as well, saying that there could be a narrative Russia built around a so-called false flag operation to justify any kind of action going into Ukraine. Of course, this is all unfolding as we speak, so we'll have to wait and see what more we hear from Russian officials in the coming hours.
Just hold on a second for me, Dorsa. Could we have the map back just briefly showing Rostov? Let's have a little look at that just to get context. So Rostov bordering those Russian separatist states of Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass region as it's known. And what Russia is saying is that Ukrainian armed vehicles were destroyed in Rostov. So Russia is claiming those tanks and 5 people who were killed moved across into Rostov, and they were killed as a result. Dorsa Jabari still with us in Moscow. Ukraine says, from what I'm reading here, and you said as well, that it's all fake news. This is kind of the narrative, isn't it, that there is this concern about what is being said from either side and who's telling the truth?
Of course, it's very difficult to verify the information on the ground in those regions at the moment. Even journalists who are in Rostov region are not allowed anywhere near the borders. There is a distance of a few kilometers they have to keep away. So it's very difficult to verify what we are getting from the state news agencies here in Moscow. But they have said that these disputed border regions have been part of a conflict that has been going on for over 8 years now. And the dispute is really between the Russian-backed separatists in Donbass and the Ukrainian military. Of course, there was a Minsk agreement that was supposed to bring some kind of a ceasefire to that area, but clearly, that is not what is happening now. And the Russian president has said that this is one of the main reasons there is so much instability in that region, because the agreement, the Minsk agreement, is not being followed by the Ukrainian military. Of course, the Ukrainian military, for their part, saying is the separatists are the ones that are actually continuing shelling and firing at the Ukrainian army personnel in that region. And in the middle of all this, we have to remember, of course, there's nearly 2 million people that live in that area. There are civilians that have really seen conflict after conflict in their daily lives. And many of them that we've spoken to, both from my colleagues in the Ukrainian side as well as the ones we've heard from crossing into Russia, there is just a sense of deep despair. The men have been told to stay behind as of Friday, the women and children and the elderly told to evacuate. If you can imagine having to be told in the middle of the night to leave your father, your husband, your brother behind, leave your country and go into a neighboring country, not knowing when you can actually go back home, if you will have a home to go back to. So it's really an astonishing situation, and it's very, very difficult to imagine the human cost of all this and the toll that it's taking on those people. Okay, thanks for now, Dorsa Jabari in Moscow. Moving to Kyiv now. Here's Andrew Simmons. Andrew, actually, this is kind of what you almost previewed when I last spoke to you in our last news hour. You were saying there was a list of things almost which had been claimed and counterclaimed, and now we can add this one to it.
Most certainly, this really isn't coming as a huge surprise to the officials here, and indeed ministers and military commanders. But it has to be said, it is serious. There's no doubt about that. The immediate response is two words: fake news. And the information war has escalated, I would say, much more than the actual military situation. You're talking about 150,000 troops. Well, you're also talking about millions of words, not all of them true, about what is going on right now. Dorsa outlined the situation in the two breakaway republics in the southeast of this country, where there is a war all of its own going on, and she outlined the position in terms of the alarm that was raised by Donetsk and Luhansk in the past 4 or 5 days, the trauma, and I'm not overstating the case at all there, that's going on for the civilians living in these breakaway republics. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, so many of them who've been evacuated. Now, the Rostov region, not just Rostov city, but the Rostov region, is very large. The Ukrainian military say is absolutely no possibility whatsoever that they would send in vehicles or indeed troops or indeed shell the area, because there was a claim only a matter of less than 12 hours ago that Ukraine had shelled Rostov, and there was an inquiry going on. In fact, we're seeing here details of that shelling, of that alleged shelling. The Ukrainians saying there's no way they'd have the range to actually get a shell into the country, and nor would they have the motivation. Why would they? Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister who's in Brussels right now, leading the forefront of a call for an investigation into that. So really, not shock here at all, expectation of this, and real serious concern.
And a reminder, Andrew, about what's or who, which country is actually really involved here. There's been so much talk about a potential summit between the US and Russia, and Ukraine was already putting its hand up to say, actually, we're the ones at most risk here.
That's right. I think you've got to look back at the weekend when President Vladimir Zelensky outlined in his speech to the Munich Security Conference. He said that the country, Ukraine, had to be factored in more with talks, negotiations, because, let's face it, its citizens are most at risk with this escalation in the conflict. So basically there is a real desire here to get more traction with the world leaders in terms of particularly NATO and the United States, with Ukraine's interests being put right on top of the stack, so to speak, and also concern if there was to be a summit, and I say if because the Kremlin has outlined doubt about whether or not this summit could take place. If that is the case, Ukraine doesn't want anything in the way of concessions to bite into its own situation here. They want de-escalation right away, and they want a ceasefire along this line of the contact line, as it's called, the front line, which separates Ukraine from the two self-declared republics.
Thank you, Andrew Simmons in Kyiv. Finally, Alan Fisher at the White House. What have you been hearing from the Biden administration this morning?
Well, the United Nations have now received a letter from the UN ambassador from the US, Bathsheba Crocker, saying that they have credible information that if the Russians were to invade Ukraine, they have a so-called hit list of people that they would immediately imprison, send to labour camps, or perhaps even kill. And on that list would include journalists, anti-corruption activists, people who are involved in religious or ethnic communities, and those of the LGBTQI+ community as well. So this warning going to Michelle Bachelet, saying that there is real concern. Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, well, unusually for a public holiday here in the United States, he's been doing the rounds of the morning shows in the United States just in the last hour or so. And he says what the Russians are planning is to repress any opposition to them if their tanks cross the border.
We believe that any military operation of the size, scope, and magnitude of what we believe the Russians are planning will be extremely violent. It will cost the lives of Ukrainians and Russians, civilians and military personnel alike. But we also have intelligence to suggest that there will be an even greater form of brutality, because this will not simply be some conventional war between two armies. It will be a war waged by Russia on the Ukrainian people to repress them, to crush them, to harm them. And that is what we laid out in detail for the UN, because we believe that the world must mobilize to counter this kind of Russian aggression should those tanks roll across the border, as we anticipate they very well may do in the coming hours or days.
Jake Sullivan saying the tanks could roll over the border in the coming hours and days, and that is a concern for the Biden administration. They know there is a meeting planned between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov on Thursday, after the Elysee Palace in Paris yesterday put out a note saying that Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin could possibly meet. The White House then put out its own statement saying there's a lot of conditions to this. First of all, no meetings are going to take place if those Russian tanks cross the border. And of course, they are deeply concerned that Lavrov and Blinken might not meet. If they do, they will set the agenda for the two leaders. How quickly that can be organised, where that will be held, all entirely unclear at the moment. A bit of the fog of war as far as the White House is concerned. But certainly the Biden administration in no doubt, as we heard on Friday from Joe Biden himself, Vladimir Putin has made the decision to invade. It's now just a case of when.
That's Alan Fisher at the White House rounding out our coverage just for now on Russia-Ukraine tension.